You're standing at the Hakone checkpoint in 1750, soaked to the bone from 3 days of mountain rain. The officials demand to see your travel permit. Again. Behind you, a merchant is being stripped and searched because someone reported he might be smuggling banned books. Ahead, the mountain pass is shrouded in fog, and you can hear wolves howling in the distance. This isn't the romantic journey of traditional travel stories. This is the reality of crossing Japan during the Edo period, when a simple trip to visit relatives could end in imprisonment, bankruptcy, or death. When the Tokugawa shogunate's paranoid security system turned every road into a potential trap, and when nature itself seemed determined to kill anyone foolish enough to leave home. Today, we're walking the dangerous roads of Edo, Japan, to discover why traveling 200 kilometers could take 2 months, cost a year's wages, and require more planning than a modern expedition to Antarctica. Introduction. The Edo period transformed Japan into what historians call a controlled society. But nowhere was this control more absolute than on the roads. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't just regulate travel, they weaponized it as a tool of political control that kept the population isolated, monitored, and dependent on local authorities. Under the Sankin Kotai system, regional daimyo were required to spend alternating years in Edo, creating massive processions that clogged the highways. But for ordinary people, travel became a privilege that required official permission, substantial wealth, and considerable courage. The government established 53 official stations along the Tokaido, the main highway between Edo and Kyoto. These weren't just rest stops. They were control points where authorities monitored every traveler, recorded their movements, and enforced restrictions that could trap people hundreds of kilometers from home. But the real dangers weren't just bureaucratic. Japan's mountainous terrain, unpredictable weather, and isolation created natural hazards that killed more travelers than bandits ever did. Rivers that were shallow and walkable in the morning could become raging torrents by afternoon. Mountain passes that looked clear could disappear into deadly fog within minutes. Travel was brutally expensive. A round trip from Edo to Osaka, roughly 500 kilometers, cost approximately 2 ryo, equivalent to 4 months' wages for a skilled craftsman. This wasn't accidental. Expensive travel meant fewer people moving around, which meant better control. Yet thousands of people still traveled, driven by religious pilgrimage, family obligations, or business necessity. Their survival depended on understanding a complex system of regulations, natural hazards, and social hierarchies that could change without warning. Chapter 1. The Permit System and Legal Traps. In 1773, a rice merchant named Yamada Heisuke left Edo with proper travel documents for a business trip to Osaka. At the Hakone checkpoint, officials declared his permit invalid due to a clerical error in the date. He was detained for 3 weeks while authorities verified his identity, by which time his business deal had collapsed and his family had given him up for dead until he returned. Traveling in Edo, Japan began long before you left home. It started with navigating a bureaucratic maze designed to discourage movement and trap the unwary. The travel permit system wasn't just administrative procedure. It was a web of legal traps that could destroy your life. The basic travel document, called a tsuko tagata, required approval from your local magistrate, who had to verify your identity, your destination, your purpose, and your financial capacity to complete the journey. But getting this document was only the beginning of your legal vulnerability. Different types of travel required different permits. Religious pilgrimage needed one document, business travel another, and family visits a third. Carrying the wrong permit could result in immediate arrest, even if your actual purpose was legitimate. The authorities deliberately made these categories ambiguous and overlapping. women faced additional restrictions that were both more severe and more arbitrarily enforced. The government feared that women traveling might be fleeing arranged marriages or carrying secret messages for political dissidents. A woman traveling alone needed special documentation explaining why no male relative was accompanying her. The shocking reality was that permits could be revoked retroactively. If authorities at any checkpoint decided your travel was suspicious, they could declare your documents invalid and arrest you for traveling without proper authorization. This meant that even legally obtained permits offered no guarantee of safe passage. Checkpoints weren't just at major boundaries. They could appear anywhere along the road. The famous Hakone checkpoint on the Tokaido was just one of over 2,000 inspection points throughout Japan. Some were permanent installations with dozens of officials. Others were temporary stops set up without notice. The inspection process itself was designed to humiliate and intimidate. Travelers were required to present their documents while kneeling, answer detailed questions about their backgrounds and intentions, and submit to physical searches that could include complete undressing. Officials had absolute authority to detain anyone for any reason. Bribery was expected, but dangerous. Checkpoint officials supplemented their meager salaries by accepting gifts from travelers, but offering too little could result in harassment, while offering too much could be interpreted as evidence of criminal activity. The correct amount varied by location, official, and circumstances that travelers couldn't predict. The permit system created a thriving black market in forged documents. Professional forgers operated in major cities, creating fake permits that could pass casual inspection but would fail under detailed scrutiny. Using forged documents carried the death penalty, but the alternative was often being unable to travel at all. Regional variations in permit requirements created additional traps. Documents that were valid in one domain might be rejected in another, leaving travelers stranded at boundaries without legal means to continue or return. Some domains deliberately changed their requirements without notice to generate revenue from stranded travelers. Chapter 2: The Economics of Movement. Travel in Edo, Japan wasn't just expensive, it was economically devastating for ordinary people. The cost structure was deliberately designed to limit mobility, and understanding these economics reveals why most Japanese never traveled more than a few kilometers from their birthplace. The basic cost of a journey from Edo to Kyoto was approximately 1 ryo and 2 bu for a commoner traveling on foot, roughly 2 months' wages for a skilled craftsman. But this was only the beginning of the financial burden that made travel a luxury few could afford. Accommodation at official post stations was regulated and expensive. A night's lodging at a standard inn cost approximately 200 mun, while a meal cost another 100 mun. These prices were fixed by government regulation, preventing competition that might lower costs. Over a 2-week journey, accommodation alone could cost more than the travel permits. Transportation costs varied dramatically by social class and circumstance. Walking was free but slow and dangerous. Hiring a horse cost 4 mon per ri, about 4 kilometers, while a palanquin cost 16 mon per ri, but could only be used by people of sufficient social status. Using inappropriate transportation could result in legal punishment. The shocking reality was that many travelers couldn't afford to return home. The financial burden of the outbound journey often exhausted their resources, leaving them stranded at their destination. Some worked for months or years to earn return passage, while others simply remained where they were, becoming permanent immigrants by economic necessity. Hidden costs multiplied the official expenses. Checkpoint fees, road tolls, and gifts to officials could double the basic travel budget. Some checkpoints charged different rates for different social classes, while others imposed arbitrary fees that travelers couldn't predict or avoid. Weather-related delays created cascading financial crises. If spring rains made rivers impassable, travelers might be stranded for weeks at expensive inns, watching their resources disappear while they waited for conditions to improve. These delays were so common that experienced travelers budgeted extra money specifically for weather contingencies. The currency system added another layer of complexity and expense. Different regions used different currencies, and exchange rates were often unfavorable to travelers. Money changers charged substantial fees, and counterfeit currency was common enough that travelers risked losing money to forgeries. Food costs varied dramatically by region and season. Rice prices could be 3 times higher in mountain areas than in agricultural regions. Travelers who couldn't afford inn meals might resort to street food or attempt to forage, both of which carried health risks that could end their journey permanently. Emergency expenses could destroy even well-planned budgets. Injury, illness, or theft might require unplanned expenditures that travelers couldn't afford. The lack of credit systems meant that running out of money often meant being unable to continue the journey or return home. Some travelers attempted to reduce costs by taking shortcuts or avoiding official routes. These alternatives were often illegal and always dangerous, but the economic pressure was so severe that many people risked imprisonment or death rather than pay the official fees. The economic burden of travel extended beyond the immediate costs. Taking time off work for extended travel meant lost wages that could devastate family finances. Many travelers borrowed money to finance their journeys, creating debt burdens that took years to repay. Chapter 3: Natural Hazards and Environmental Dangers. In 1771, a carpenter from Sendai died trying to cross the flooded Oi River on his return from a pilgrimage to Ise. His body was recovered 3 days later, swept downstream along with his tools and the protective amulets he had traveled so far to obtain. Japan's geography created travel hazards that were often more deadly than human threats. The mountainous terrain, unpredictable weather, and seasonal dangers turned every journey into a potential survival situation that tested travelers' endurance and preparation. River crossings were the most dangerous aspect of travel in Edo, Japan. The country's steep mountains and heavy seasonal rains created waterways that could change from gentle streams to raging torrents within hours. The Oi River on the Tokaido was so dangerous that the government prohibited bridge construction to maintain better control over travelers. Professional river porters at major crossings charged fees that varied with water levels and danger. During high water, these fees could increase tenfold, trapping travelers who couldn't afford the crossing. The porters themselves were often desperate men who took extreme risks for money, leading to frequent drownings of both porters and passengers. The shocking reality was that some travelers chose to attempt illegal crossings rather than pay the official fees. These unauthorized crossings had mortality rates that approached 50% during dangerous conditions. Bodies of failed river crossers were so common that official procedures existed for dealing with unidentified drowning victims. Mountain passes presented hazards that changed with elevation and season. The Hakone Pass, despite being on the main highway, claimed lives regularly due to sudden weather changes, avalanches, and precipitous trails that became impassable in fog or snow. Travelers who left the designated path often disappeared completely. Weather prediction was primitive and unreliable. Travelers might begin a mountain crossing in clear conditions only to encounter blizzards, floods, or fog that could persist for days. The lack of accurate weather information meant that travel decisions were often gambles with deadly consequences. Winter travel was particularly hazardous but often unavoidable. Heavy snow could close mountain passes for months, but business obligations or family emergencies sometimes forced people to attempt dangerous winter journeys. The mortality rate for winter travel was approximately 3 times higher than summer travel. Seasonal dangers included typhoons that could devastate entire regions, spring floods that washed out roads and bridges, and autumn storms that brought both wind and water damage. The timing of these hazards was unpredictable enough that travelers couldn't reliably plan around them. Wildlife posed threats that varied by region and season. Mountain areas had bears and wild boar that could attack travelers, while remote areas had wolf packs that were particularly dangerous during winter when food was scarce. The government maintained some wildlife control, but travelers were largely responsible for their own protection. Disease outbreaks could turn travel routes into death traps. Cholera, smallpox, and other epidemic diseases spread rapidly along travel routes, creating situations where continuing the journey and returning home were equally dangerous. Some travelers found themselves quarantined for weeks in areas where disease was suspected. Geological hazards included earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic activity that could destroy roads and bridges without warning. Japan's seismic activity meant that routes that were safe in the morning might be impassable by evening, stranding travelers in dangerous locations. The lack of emergency services meant that travelers who encountered natural hazards were largely on their own. There were no rescue services, no emergency medical care, and no reliable communication systems that could summon help. Survival depended entirely on personal preparation and luck. Navigation challenges were compounded by the lack of accurate maps and reliable signage. Travelers often relied on verbal directions that could be outdated, inaccurate, or deliberately misleading. Getting lost in mountainous terrain could easily prove fatal, especially during harsh weather conditions. Chapter 4: Bandits, Crime, and Social Dangers. The romantic tales of honorable outlaws like Nezumi Kozo mask a darker reality of desperate criminals who preyed on travelers with systematic violence that the authorities often ignored or even encouraged when it served their interests. Bandit activity was concentrated along remote sections of major highways where travelers were isolated and official patrols were infrequent. The Tokaido, despite being the most heavily traveled route, had numerous sections where attacks were common enough that experienced travelers hired guards or traveled in groups. The shocking truth was that many bandits weren't just common thieves. They were ronin, former samurai who had lost their masters, jobs, and income during the Edo period's social restructuring. These displaced warriors retained their military skills, but lacked legitimate means of support, creating a class of highly skilled criminals who were more dangerous than ordinary thieves. Bandit tactics evolved to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of Edo period travel. Rather than simple highway robbery, organized gangs used intelligence networks to identify wealthy travelers, plan attacks for maximum isolation, and coordinate with corrupt officials who could provide protection or information. The government's response to banditry was deliberately inconsistent. In some cases, authorities pursued bandits aggressively, but in others, they used bandit activity as an excuse to increase travel restrictions and checkpoint security. Some officials even cooperated with bandits in exchange for information about travelers' activities. Inn-based crime was more common than highway robbery, but less dramatic, making it largely invisible in historical records. Unscrupulous innkeepers drugged travelers, stole their possessions, and sometimes murdered them, disposing of bodies in ways that made the crimes appear to be accidents or natural deaths. Female travelers faced sexual assault risks that were severe enough to discourage women from traveling alone. The legal system provided little protection for women who were assaulted, and the social stigma associated with sexual violence meant that many attacks went unreported, creating a climate of fear that restricted women's mobility. Traveling merchants were particularly vulnerable to systematic criminal operations. Bandits would track valuable cargo shipments, plan coordinated attacks, and sometimes corrupt officials to ensure that investigations were ineffective. The loss of a merchant's goods could destroy their business and ruin their family's economic security. The line between official authority and criminal activity was often blurred. Some checkpoint officials extorted money from travelers through threats of imprisonment or harassment. These legal shakedowns were indistinguishable from robbery, except that they were conducted by government employees. Regional variations in law enforcement created opportunities for criminals to exploit jurisdictional boundaries. Bandits would commit crimes in one domain and flee to another, knowing that pursuit across boundaries required complex negotiations between different authorities that rarely resulted in arrests. The justice system's response to travel-related crimes was influenced by the social status of both victims and perpetrators. Attacks on high-status travelers were pursued aggressively, while crimes against commoners were often ignored. This selective enforcement encouraged criminal activity and discouraged reporting. Some travelers attempted to defend themselves by carrying weapons, but this created additional legal risks. Commoners were restricted in the types of weapons they could carry, and using weapons in self-defense could result in criminal charges even when the travelers were clearly victims of attack. The economic impact of crime extended beyond immediate losses. Travelers who were robbed might be stranded without resources to continue their journey or return home. Some became permanent refugees, unable to afford passage to their destination or back to their starting point. Chapter 5: The Psychology of Isolation and Endurance. Extended travel in Edo, Japan, created psychological challenges that were as dangerous as physical hazards. The isolation, uncertainty, and constant stress of navigating a hostile system created mental health impacts that affected travelers' decision-making and survival abilities. The psychological impact of leaving one's home community was severe in a society where most people never traveled more than a few kilometers from their birthplace. The familiar social networks, economic relationships, and cultural practices that defined daily life disappeared completely, leaving travelers psychologically adrift. Constant surveillance and documentation created paranoia that affected travelers' behavior in ways that could increase their danger. The knowledge that every interaction was potentially being monitored by government agent made it difficult to form the relationships and trust networks that were essential for safe travel. The unpredictability of travel conditions created chronic stress that impaired judgment and decision-making. Travelers never knew if their permits would be accepted, if weather would delay their journey, or if they would have enough money to complete their trip. This uncertainty created anxiety that could lead to poor choices. Language barriers within Japan were more significant than most people realize. Regional dialects were so different that travelers might have difficulty communicating in areas distant from their home region. This communication difficulty increased isolation and made it harder to get accurate information about local conditions. The social isolation of travel was compounded by the class-based restrictions that limited interaction between different social groups. Travelers often found themselves in communities where their social status was unclear or inappropriate, creating awkward situations that could escalate into dangerous conflicts. Sleep deprivation was a constant factor in travel stress. The combination of uncomfortable accommodations, unfamiliar environments, and anxiety about safety made it difficult for travelers to get adequate rest. Chronic fatigue impaired physical performance and mental sharpness, when both were essential for survival. The psychological pressure of representing one's home community while traveling created additional stress. Travelers were expected to maintain appropriate behavior and appearance that reflected well on their families and communities. This social pressure was particularly intense for people traveling on business or religious missions. Cultural differences between regions could create psychological disorientation. That made travel feel like entering a foreign country. Different customs, foods, social practices, and religious observances made travelers feel like outsiders even within their own country. The lack of reliable communication with home created anxiety about family and business responsibilities left behind. Travelers had no way to know if emergencies had occurred, if their families were safe, or if their economic interests were being properly managed during their absence. Some travelers developed what modern psychology would recognize as anxiety disorders related to their travel experiences. The constant vigilance required for safe travel, combined with the social isolation and economic stress, created lasting psychological impacts that affected their ability to function normally after returning home. The decision-making process for ending a journey prematurely was complicated by the psychological investment in completing the trip. Travelers who had endured significant hardship and expense often continued dangerous journeys rather than admit failure, even when conditions had become genuinely life-threatening. Chapter 6: Survival Strategies and Adaptation. Successful travelers in Edo, Japan developed sophisticated survival strategies that went far beyond basic preparation. These techniques, passed down through informal networks and hard-won experience, meant the difference between completing a journey and becoming another casualty of the road. Experienced travelers formed informal networks that shared current information about road conditions, checkpoint procedures, and local dangers. These networks operated outside official channels, providing intelligence that was often more accurate and timely than government information. Timing strategies were crucial for minimizing natural hazards and bureaucratic obstacles. Skilled travelers knew which seasons were safest for specific routes, which days of the week had lighter checkpoint activity, and which times of day offered the best weather conditions for dangerous crossings. Financial strategies included hidden money caches, emergency funds kept in different locations, and informal credit arrangements with merchants along major routes. These techniques helped travelers survive unexpected expenses or theft without being stranded. Social camouflage techniques helped travelers blend into local populations and avoid unwanted attention. This included adopting local dialects, wearing regionally appropriate clothing, and understanding local customs well enough to appear to belong. The most successful travelers were those who understood that survival required adapting to a system designed to be hostile to their presence. They developed the skills, knowledge, and psychological resilience necessary to navigate dangers that killed the unprepared. Conclusion: travel in Edo, Japan was a trial by fire that tested every aspect of human endurance and ingenuity. The survivors weren't just lucky, they were skilled navigators of a system designed to control, discourage, and exploit them at every turn. The legacy of Edo period travel restrictions shaped Japanese culture in ways that persist today. The experience of isolation, the importance of local community, and the psychological impact of controlled mobility influenced Japanese social development for centuries. Understanding these historical realities helps us appreciate both the courage of those who traveled despite the dangers and the sophistication of the control systems that made such journeys necessary risks rather than normal activities. The next time you complain about airport security or traffic delays, remember the travelers of Edo, Japan, for whom the greatest danger wasn't what lay ahead, but the system beneath their feet. Thanks for watching. In the next episode, we'll discover how the 90% of Japan's population who couldn't afford to travel, the peasants, survived their own deadly challenges of war, crushing taxation, and famines so severe that parents had to make unthinkable choices to keep their families alive.